Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Have you ever looked at a histogram and thought to yourself, what does that thing do anyway? Or have you come home from taking photos with photos that are too dark or that have parts of them overexposed? In this video, I'm going to show you how to read a histogram and use the information in it to take better photos, to do a better job with photo processing. I'm also going to dispel some histogram myths. If you stay till the end, I'll give you two simple tips that I use all the time to make sure that I have the perfect exposure and the bright highlights and that I can always recover some details, both in my photos and processing. My name is Simon D'Entremont. I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature and wildlife photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. A nice thing about being a YouTuber is people send you stuff. I've been thinking of making this video for a while, but I didn't have an easy way of showing you what was my camera's viewfinder. So I've been thinking of getting a monitor. Just then the folks from Hollyland reached out and asked if I was interested in trying their Mars M1 combination monitor, receiver, and transmitter. They've sent me one, so we're gonna hook it up and try it out. Okay, here we go. This should come in really handy for my behind the scenes videos, and I can start thinking, because it's a remote and a transmitter and receiver as well, I'm starting to think about some remote wildlife photography scenarios. If you have some good ideas, let me know in the comments below. Now, one of the most important things this is going to do for me is when I'm doing photography and videography for you, I'm going to be able to monitor everything on this bigger screen, including having a histogram, which is really, really important for having the right exposure. And that brings us to the topic of the day. Knowing how to read and use a histogram is a really important part of photography and image processing. Because histograms are universal between photography and image processing, what you learn in this video, you're going to be able to use twice. Let's start off by knowing where to find the histogram. On a Canon camera, you press the info button a few times and the histogram will appear on the screen. On a Nikon camera, you enable it under the playback menu under playback display options, and you press the info button to display it on your back LCD. On a Sony camera, just press the display button. If it doesn't show up, enable it in the display options menu. On a DSLR, make sure you're in live view and hit the info button. So what's a histogram? A histogram is a graphical representation of what's called the tonal range of the pixels in your photo. That is the distribution of dark pixels to light pixels in your photo. It's placed on a bar chart format with the black pixels being represented on the far left, all the way to white pixels all the way on the far right. The middle represents the midtones. So for this photo, the dark pixels are represented over here, the middle tones are represented here, and the lightest pixels are represented way over here. The taller the peaks, the more pixels of that brightness that there are. So photos with a peak on the left are very dark, and as you may have guessed, photos with a peak all the way on the right are very light. This photo has a peak in the middle because it has a lot of medium tones. The darker tones are represented over here, and the lighter tones over here. Okay, let's have a look at my little owl buddy here and see what this histogram tells us about this image. As you can see here, while the owl is very light, most of the pixels in this image are very dark. Because of that, the histogram is moved all the way over to the left. The bright pixels of the owl are represented in the histogram all the way over here to the right. Note that if I make the image darker, the owl is underexposed because the owl is supposed to be white, but there's no information on the right-hand side of the histogram. To properly expose this owl, I should brighten the image until the whites are represented on the right-hand side of the histogram. Note also that if I make the image too bright, the histogram is touching up on the right-hand side, and if I take a photo, we can see that the owl is overexposed. And here's an opportunity to dispel a myth about histograms, and it's one that's often repeated. It's that a histogram should look like a mountain, with a lot of information in the peaks in the middle, falling off to the right and off to the left. That's absolutely not true. Some images are meant to be light and others to be dark. In this photo of an owl, it has very few light tones and a lot of dark tones, so the histogram will be way over to the left even if the owl is well exposed. Now let's note here that the height of the histogram is not very important. It just represents how many pixels of that brightness there are in the image. There's no magic cutoff, there's no ideal height, so the height of the histogram does not really matter. What really matters is whether or not the histogram is touching on the left-hand edge or the right-hand edge. This is a critical piece of information that comes out of the histogram. The reason this is important is because if your histogram is touching on the left-hand side, that is pure black. There's no information there. The same thing is true on the right-hand edge. If your histogram is touching the right-hand edge, you have what we say blown out your whites. There's no information there. If you try to darken it, all you get is a darker white, which is gray again. There's no information from your photo stored there anymore. This can often be the case if you're out doing photography in the bright midday sun. Your camera can't capture all of the tonal range, including the bright highlights, and as such, you blow out the highlights in your photo and they're not ever recoverable. That's why a lot of people try to avoid shooting in the bright midday sun. Whereas if you don't clip the right-hand side of the histogram, your brightest tones can be recovered to show some detail by lowering the exposure. Let's see how this works in this bird photo. I have some very bright tones here, but as you can see, if I lower the exposure, I can actually recover some detail. That's because I did not touch the right-hand side of the histogram in my exposure. Because of this, unless you're doing it for some artistic effect, your goal in using the histogram is to take a photo that neither touches the right hand or the left hand edge. Either observe this live by looking at the histogram before taking an exposure, or take a test shot and check the exposure on the back LCD. Then adjust the exposure to make sure you leave a small gap on the right hand and left hand edge of the histogram. Now, if you're trying to get pure blacks or pure whites for artistic effect, it's totally okay to have the histogram huddled up on the left hand or the right hand side. But know that this decision is not reversible. You're never going to be able to ever recover information in those darkest or lightest areas if you use this technique. So the histogram's primary purpose is to show you at a glance whether or not your exposure is right. Whatever you decide right needs to be. Very often you'll be using it to make sure you don't overexpose your photo. You may be thinking, why can't I just use the back LCD to determine whether or not I've got the right exposure for my photo? That's because your back LCD can fool you. When I'm shooting in very dark conditions, like shooting a Milky Way at night or in very dark storms, my back LCD looks really bright, fooling me into thinking that my photos are well exposed. When I get home, I can notice often that they're very underexposed. The same thing happens under bright sunlight. Your back LCD looks very dark, making you think you should add some exposure to your photos and make them brighter. Often this leads to overexposure and blowing out the whites. Using a histogram is a foolproof way of knowing what the exposure of your photo is like, regardless of the conditions. Now there can even be photos with lots of lights, lots of darks, and very little in the midtones. This would be the case with a silhouette, with a bright background, but a very dark subject in foreground because it's not exposed to full sunlight. But that can be okay. If you don't clip them, you can recover the highlights, recover the shadows, and make a beautiful photo like in this case. But sometimes leaving it as a silhouette is what makes the best photo, having a nice contrast between the dark and the light. And I promised you some extra tips. One is that there's an extra way your camera can show you whether or not you've blown out your highlights. These are called blinkies or highlight alerts. You enable them in your camera and they will show on the back LCD as blinking areas if you've overexposed them. On Canon cameras, these are called highlight alerts. On Nikon cameras, cycle through the display options until you find highlights. On Sony cameras, hit the display button several times until they show. There's another useful piece of information to know while using blinkies on your camera. You've heard that shooting in RAW gives you more dynamic range than shooting JPEG. This is evidenced here by the camera's use of blinkies. That's because the blinkies are based on a JPEG of your image, not the original RAW photo. That means that the RAW photo in your camera has a little bit more information in it than what is shown and used as blinkies. The lesson here is if you're using blinkies, it's okay to have just a little bit of blinkies in the brightest parts of your image. Just try not to have too much of them. The other lesson is this shows you why you should shoot in RAW. You have more dynamic range and more ability to recover highlights and deep shadows than you do if you're shooting JPEG. Also in image processing, it's very popular to adjust the lights and darks in your image to make sure it comes out looking the way you want it to. But how do you make sure that you aren't clipping the darks and the lights in doing so? In Lightroom, there's a trick to do this. The way to do this is while you're adjusting the whites and the blacks, hold down the Alt key while you're adjusting the sliders. Your highlights or your darks will show as clipped in color if you're holding down the Alt key. A A popular processing technique is to lower the blacks until you just start clipping them and to raise the whites again until you just start clipping them. This gives your image a lot of contrast and a nice tonal range. Either in nailing your exposure the next time you're out in tricky conditions, improving your processing, or just getting really creative. I hope you can put these tips to use the very next time you go out. I know you can do it. See you next time.